Step right up to the greatest ride in the entire carnival, what we're calling the budget autofocus 50mm f1.8 showdown. Now you right there, you look like you enjoy a good adrenaline rush, a bit of a thrill, some unexpected twists and turns, and maybe even a couple of loop-the-loops. Well, hold on to your cummerbund and tell your kids to wait for you at the exit, because this ride is going to be too much for the little ones to handle. So this video is going to look at 4 different 50mm f1.8 autofocus lenses. We're going to talk about them in alphabetical order throughout this video, and that's 7 Artisans, Meike, Sony, and Viltrox. Originally, this video was conceived just to look at the 3 third-party lenses, but I added the Sony as a control lens to see how a typical OEM lens of the same price point would compare to equivalent third-party lenses. These lenses were released in the alphabetical order in late 2023, early 2024, late 2019, and late 2023 respectively. For your bottom line up front, I had expected that all 3 third-party lenses would be optically identical. I really honestly thought all 3 of these lenses were going to be the exact same thing with a different logo and slightly different interface. And then I looked at the optical designs, and it was clear that all 3 of the third-party lenses are very different. And they also perform much differently too. The cost of the third-party lenses were, in order of low to high price, $160 for the Meike, $228 for the 7 Artisans, and $360 for the Viltrox. On the used market, the Sony sells for around $150 US, and new it sells for about $100 more, and that puts it right in line cost-wise with the Meike for a used copy or the 7 Artisans for a new one. Now, if price correlates to quality, then the Viltrox ought to win this contest handily. As a bit of a spoiler, wow, price did not correlate to quality at all. So when I sat down, here was the prediction that I went into this lens showdown with, and I had some experience using each of the lenses except for the Viltrox. Early on, I figured that the Sony would be the technical standout, and the 7 Artisans would create the most visually interesting images, and that the Meike would be fine and entirely uninspiring. I had no idea what the Viltrox would do, but having used and liked the 20mm f2.8 Viltrox quite a lot, I expected that the Viltrox would outperform at least the other 2 third-party lenses. Now for fun, I also brought out the Sony Zeiss Sonnar 55mm f1.8 for a few tests, just to see how the 4 lenses in this video compare to a $1,000 lens of the same spec in some select cases. The Zeiss isn't going to get graded, it's not going to be ranked, but the comparison results that I did were pretty interesting. Now, be sure to buckle up your lap belt and pull that overhead harness down to its full and locked position, because this ride's going all over the place. Your focal length and angle of view are 50mm on all of these, with some really minor variation in the angle of view degrees, which in practice seems to be significantly greater than that reported by the manufacturers. The Meike has the tightest angle of view, but it feels more like a 55mm lens, and the Viltrox has a significantly wider field of view to the point that it almost feels like a 45mm lens. The aperture range is 1.8 through 16 on all of these, but the Sony, which reaches 22. The element and group count on these range wildly. The design type here was hard to parse for sure, but the Sony's definitely a double gauze, and the 7 Artisans and Viltrox, to me, both look like double gauze derivatives, possibly Ultrons or something like that, but don't quote me on that. However, I'm going to throw up here this stripped down diagram, and it removes some of the extraneous elements, and it makes it look like the 7 Artisans and Viltrox are definitely in the double gauze design family. The Meike, it's not anything I've seen before, and so on all of these but the Sony, I'm guessing at the specific design type. The filter sizes on these range from 49 to 62 millimeters. The closest focus is best with the Sony, coming in at 0.43 meters, and it's worst on the Meike at 0.63 meters. And man, that 0.2 meters feels like way, way more than that. For your drive type, all of these lenses have autofocus capabilities with some differences in the autofocus motor type. Also, all of them have manual focus capability, with 2 of the lenses having autofocus manual focus switches and 2 of them having manual focus control being strictly controlled on camera. Also, the 7 Artisans and Viltrox have on-lens aperture control rings, which is a very, very nice feature for people who want to do video work with these lenses. The native mount for the lenses I used was Sony E for each of the 4 of these. However, the third-party lenses are also available in Nikon Z, and the Meike is also available in L. If you have a Nikon Z camera, there's no reason to think of that any of these third-party lenses would perform differently on your system than on my Sony camera. The dimensions ranged somewhat, with the Sony being very small and the Meike very large compared to the rest of the lineup. Weight also ranged across the lenses, and the 7 Artisans definitely feels the heaviest. So if you'd like to check out all the test photos, in the video's description there's a link to an album, and that album has full res images of all the sample shots that I took for this video, including ones that don't make it to the cut for this video, so you can look at those and really examine them. Sharpness is going to be based on the close focus that I test photos, which was a 0.9 meter subject distance. Just for whatever reason, I could not get the tripod to rest closer than that for this test shoot. But anyway, I'm going to base it on 3 different test shots: f1.8, f5.6, and f16. And also I'm going to look at the hyperfocal test shots for judging sharpness. The Viltrox could not focus to infinity, and that's frustrating and disappointing for the most expensive lens in this test. And also for funsies, the Sony Zeiss Sonnar 55mm f1.8 saw that all these lenses were going on a test shoot, and it decided to crash the party. It's not going to be ranked, but it will give us a reference for how a $1,000 lens in this focal range performs. At close focus and f1.8, all the lenses are equivalently sharp on the plane of sharpest focus. There is truly no difference. And that was more shocking than that time that I put a butter knife into a 3-phase transformer plug, which was actually just last week. But looking at the boot fabric just behind the plane of sharpest focus, now that shows the lens's differences. The Sony 50mm is by far the best in terms of the transition from sharp to blurry. The Viltrox comes in a close second here, and the Zeiss is right behind it. The 7 Artisans is a distant third and shows some visually uncomfortable blur that stems from performance that we're going to see in the Zeidel analysis, and the same is true from the Meike, which is the worst in this metric. Stopping down the close shots to f5.6, the Sony 50mm has amazing sharpness in the boot fabric and texture. The Meike takes a solid second here, and the Viltrox a very close third. The 7 Artisans shows up here in fourth, and the Zeiss, were it ranked, would show up last with an apology and some gas station roses. Now, all that said, at f5.6, none of these lenses actually disappoint. They're all really good. This is like such a very minor difference between the 5 different lenses. At f16, at the closest focus point, all of the lenses begin to suffer diffraction softness, but looking at the text in the boot tag, the 7 Artisans has the best sharpness here, and the Sony 50mm comes in a very close second. At the hyperfocal distance, with all of the lenses set to f16 for fair comparison, this test checks the quality of sharpness over a deep depth of field, and to that end, 3 of the lenses perform very well with minor differences. The differences here come down to how well the lenses rendered the pine tree needles behind the boots, as that was the actual focus point of all of the lenses. The Zeiss would definitely take first here, but instead the Sony does, because it does a great job of rendering the needles individually when viewed at 100%. The Viltrox and 7 Artisans are equally good in this regard, and the Meike is a distant last for this part of the test. So just adding up these 4 category rankings for these different test shots, overall, the Sony trounced the competition by a handy margin. A result reflected in the images, by the way. The 7 Artisans very slightly bests the Viltrox, and the Meike is still trying to figure out where the tree in the background even is. Build quality was a narrow victory for the Sony. The Sony is safe from a design perspective and feels kind of like an old pair of sneakers, which is to say familiar, comfortable, and just there. The 7 Artisans would have won this had there been 2 differences. The focus ring is very hard to move compared to the rest of the lenses, and the autofocus manual focus switch is way too easy to flip into the opposite position. In fact, like if you brush the lens up against your hip while you're moving it around or carrying it, you will flip that switch. The aperture ring on the 7 Artisans is a nice touch, and it does work well. The Viltrox beat the Meike in a coin flip because, look, a lens at the US dollars 360 price point should focus to infinity, period. That's an expensive lens, especially by third-party standards, and if the people who built this lens missed that glaring quality control problem, what else did they miss? But the overall feel of the Viltrox is pretty fantastic. The Meike takes last despite the weather ring because it feels the least well-made, and the autofocus manual focus switch, again, flips in and out of position like it's part of the hokey pokey. Star quality could easily be rated differently based on the stars at each stop. Starting with f2.8, at some apertures, each lens is by far the best. Honestly, I love the way that all the lenses render stars, but I'm going to give this one to the 7 Artisans over the Meike by a margin so slim that Jesus himself would say, yeah, a camel could definitely get through the eye of a needle way easier than that. The Viltrox will take third here because the secondary point character is nice when the lens stops down from f8 and smaller, but is not as compelling at f5.6 and wider. The Sony here takes last, solely because the points are inconsistent across the apertures, and sometimes they look like fans, other times they look like stars. That's just a big pet peeve of mine. For distortion, 3 of these lenses distort reality like a demagogue. The Sony does not, or at worst might have very slight barrel distortion across the top and bottom of the frame, but that gives it a very easy first place. The remaining rankings come down to how much the other lenses pinch the test chart like your grandma pinches your cheek. For this, the Meike takes second with the least pincushion distortion, the 7 Artisans third, and the Viltrox a distant fourth because the world in front of it puckers like it was force-fed the dust at the bottom of a dozen Sour Patch Kids bags. Light loss can be graded on either the quality of light loss or the amount. Personally, I like the look of the 7 Artisans light loss the best, but we try to do things empirically here, so we'll be scoring based on the amount of light loss. At f1.8, the differences are stark. The Viltrox has the least light loss wide open, with the Meike coming in second. The Sony and then the 7 Artisans round out the wide open rank. Light loss on the Sony is gone by f2.8 and almost gone on the Viltrox. The Meike has even illumination by f4, and the 7 Artisans decides to catch up with everyone else here at f8. So we'll go with the rankings based on when lenses stop exhibiting light loss. Sony, Viltrox, Meike, 7 Artisans. Flare and ghosting were tested both with and without a hood, since all of the lenses included a removable hood. A hood, by the way, just as a note, should have an effect. But at least the 7 Artisans hood had no benefit whatsoever. The Meike lens hood does have some effect and shows that, yes, most manufacturers include lens hoods much more for appearance than to give the lenses any sort of functional light protection. Petal hoods can protrude way further in front of a lens than any of the petal hoods included with the 3 third-party lenses do. And that means that the 3 third-party lenses would all benefit from much longer lens hoods to prevent flare. This test was done in a way that really stresses the lens's ability to prevent flare, and by and large, you would never be doing this in real-world shooting. The 7 Artisans had periodic point-type flares from bright light. The Meike exhibited localized veiling flare. The Sony exhibited no perceptible flare, but did have a double gauze typical ghost that appeared with bright source point light. The Viltrox exhibited strong ghosts that, honestly, could have some aesthetic uses, and veiling flare also appeared around strong lights. Removing the lens hood increased the issues in the Sony, but no other lenses really saw a degradation in flare and ghosting performance, which indicates that the hoods are largely useless on them. For this test, because results are based on flare and ghosting prevention rather than image benefit, the results will be the 7 Artisans in first, Sony second, Meike, and Viltrox. So next we're going to analyze the blurry areas, and let's jump in here with source point lights near the lens, but with the lenses focused at infinity. Now the 7 Artisans and Viltrox, the latter to a huge extent, show a spherical element onion rings that arise from the lathe milling of the molds used to cast the poured glass or hot molded glass as spherical elements. The Sony shows this too, but to a minor degree. The Meike, having no spherical elements, shows very uniform blurry lights and delivers a great performance that takes the top slot in the infinity focus blurry lights rating. Shifting focus to the closest focus point with the same lights, the 7 Artisans onion rings fade away faster than a boo-boo on your kid's knee when they get a band-aid and a smooch. The Meike again delivers strikingly uniform light illumination. The Sony exhibits slight onion ring character with limited perimeter brightness. And the Viltrox looks like it did in the first test, but somehow worse. And the hair that's trapped inside of it, so annoying and frustrating, has rotated. Again, here the Meike takes the top slot on the way that it renders blurry lights. Going to the dots test chart though, the story really changes. The 7 Artisans has a very strange performance here with the coma smears near the image center pointing toward the image center and then disappearing near the APS-C image area, and then the performance beyond the APS-C area is nearly perfect with a pixel or two of chromatic aberration. This is a curious performance we've not seen around here before, but it appears to indicate strong field curvature. The Meike has a different performance with noticeable chromatic aberration married with noticeable spherical aberration that causes red glows around highlights, which is uniform throughout the entire image into the very corners where there is also some tangential astigmatism popping in to say hello. The Sony has eerily similar performance to the Meike, but the astigmatism has a bit of coma in it, and that also arises nearer the image center. The Viltrox delivers an incredible performance here with very minor chromatic aberration and some coma in the corners, but the coma here is minor. And as our $1,000 lens comparison, the Zeiss basically performs incredibly well with a pixel or two of chromatic aberration in the corners of this image and very little sharpness loss as well. So were it ranked, obviously the Zeiss would win handily here, but it's not ranked, thankfully for everyone else. Overall, for aberration control, the Viltrox is taking first, Sony second, Meike third, and the 7 Artisans last. So given that these are the first autofocus lenses I've put into a showdown, I'm changing up this category just a little bit, and we're going to talk about a few things related to the lenses and focus. The first one is mounting ease, which honestly is only in here because the 7 Artisans mounts and comes off of the cameras so smoothly and absolutely beautifully. Like, I did not know a lens could mount and unmount so nicely. On the other side of the spectrum, the Meike really fights to be mounted to the camera. The Viltrox was closer to the 7 Artisans and the Sony closer to the Meike. As a reference, with my A7 IV resting loosely in the tripod head, the 7 Artisans was the only lens that could be mounted and removed without the camera noticeably rocking. The aperture ring and iris for the two lenses that have an aperture ring was a nice addition. The 7 Artisans and Viltrox have the aperture rings and those lack detents, but they are not truly stepless because they do not close down the aperture smoothly. Each one of these lenses stops the lens down in third stop increments, and moving slowly, the slight stop down jerkiness is a little bit more apparent. But with a slightly fast aperture shift in video, that might not be noticeable. Breathing wasn't tested in depth, but I did some focus throw shots with these, and the Sony had the most breathing with a noticeable magnification change across both short and long focus throws, which stands to reason as it's the only lens without internal focusing. The Viltrox arrived third in this regard with a breathing performance that, for most people, would be just fine. The Meike was very slightly better, and the 7 Artisans took an easy top slot here with no breathing that I could perceive in my limited singular test. So while these up to this point haven't been a scored category, this one especially does hint at the 7 Artisans likely being the best for focus pulls and video shots, and in general, the 7 Artisans does feel like it would be the best of these 4 lenses for someone interested in these for video. Manual focus control and handling is going to take us back to the rankings, and they're going to be based on manual focus control accuracy, fine focus control at close focus distances, which means that how much the focus ring needed to move more or less to focus the lens when the focus point got closer to the camera, which helps with fine focus of close subjects and also mimics the way that actual manual focus lenses work more closely. Also, I'm going to kind of grade these on how stiff or smooth or loose the focusing ring felt. All the lenses had quick and accurate focus control when adjusting the focusing ring. None had any lag, is what that means. When the ring moved, the focus changed. The 7 Artisans was the only one that had a slower rate of focus with closer focus points, and I really like that a lot. The Meike and Viltrox both had slower manual focus, meaning that more rotation was needed for the same distance changes than did the Sony. The Sony flew through the focus range very quickly. Honestly, I hadn't expected any variation in the lenses in this regard at all. I just assumed that how much the focus ring movement was needed for manual focusing changes was like some camera setting buried in a menu that I just don't go into very often. The 7 Artisans focus ring 2 was very hard to rotate compared to the others, whereas the Sony was very easy to spin. The Meike and Viltrox felt about the same and fine. Honestly, the 7 Artisans felt much like a manual focus lens when used in manual focus mode, and so it's going to take first here even though the focus ring is pretty stiff. The Viltrox handled well too and was smoother than the Meike in manual focusing. The Sony takes last because the lens moves through the focus range faster than a clown with a chainsaw moves through your nightmares. For the autofocus speed test, I recorded the autofocus action on the flip-out screen of my A7 IV with my with my Fuji GFX mount 50S2, and then I counted the video time from when autofocus began on the A7 IV screen to when the A7 IV provided green box autofocus confirmation. Then I trimmed each clip in DaVinci Resolve so I could see how long elapsed from when the focus began to shift to when focus was confirmed. I tested each lens 3 times except the Viltrox, which I tested more, something like 8, and we'll get into why in a moment. The best I could do was to get this to the 100th of a second with some asterisks that exact frame placement and trim position available in DaVinci Resolve could alter the results by up to 3/100ths of a second. Fundamentally, most of the results indicated that autofocus speed variations were within the margin of error of what I could test and indicate that autofocus performance would be functionally the same for all of the lenses. A couple of outliers existed in that the Zeiss was consistently about 2 frames faster than the Sony and about 3 or 4 frames faster than the third-party lenses. All of the lenses were a bit faster going from far focus to close than vice versa. The 7 Artisans hunted on one of the tests, which, if we discount that, places it just a hair behind the Sony. The Meike was a bit slower than the 7 Artisans. The Viltrox takes last here because I tested it 8 times, and on 6 of those, it could not deliver focus confirmation at all. And when that happened, the autofocus box on my Sony A7 IV screen turned purple instead of green. This was an abysmal result. And combined with the inability of this lens to reach infinity focus, it makes me think it's a lemon. But here's the deal. If there are going to be bad lenses that go out, then yeah, the makers should be penalized for that if those lenses end up in the hands of a random YouTuber who does arbitrary tests on them. Because here's the thing, this lens could just as easily have landed in your hands, and if I hadn't bought it, someone else would have. So no, there will be neither leeway nor forgiveness for Viltrox for letting a lens this bad leave the factory, especially given how expensive this paperweight was. For autofocus accuracy, the Sony was by far the best in this category, and it was the only lens that never once hunted for focus. I used the test results from the above category to determine the average time that the lenses needed to achieve focus. And for fairness, I also eliminated the highest result for each lens, and then averaged the results from the tests. The Sony took an average of 0.122 seconds to achieve focus when focusing from just shy of a meter to about 10 meters away. The 7 Artisans and Meike tied at 0.132 seconds. The Viltrox only achieved focus on 2 test focus shifts and had an average of 0.215 seconds for those results. Were the Zeiss competing here, it would have destroyed the competition with an incredible 0.104 second time to shift focus. So, in the end, the lenses fell into 2 closely linked groups, with the Sony, I doubt this was ever in question, being the strongest by a margin over the 7 Artisans. Given that the Sony of this spec is available used for the lowest price of any of the lenses in this video, it's the clear winner of this contest overall. But to be fair, it was really just included as a spoiler, and the original conceit for this video was to test just the 3 third-party lenses. The results wouldn't change among those 3 third-party lenses with the Sony removed, and there's no case where I can see recommending either the Meike or the Viltrox over the 7 Artisans. The 7 Artisans, as of this video's recording, costs $68 more than the Meike, and it is worth it. If the Viltrox worked, it might be almost as good as the 7 Artisans, but let's face it, it does not work. And that's a problem because it indicates a larger failing of quality control at the Viltrox factory. And for US dollars, $132 more than the 7 Artisans, for the cost of the Viltrox, you could buy both the 7 Artisans new and a used Sony. The Viltrox is such a clear and distant loser here that I cannot envision a reason that somebody should spend money on it. Hey, and if you enjoyed this video, check out this other one you'll probably really like too.